Hi, I'm Warrick from Harder and Steenbeck, and today's video is debunking airbrush maintenance myths. Now, I've been in the game for many years, actually several decades now, and one of the things that I've noticed over all of this period of time is that people do overcomplicate the maintenance of the airbrush, and sometimes in a way that damages their airbrushes. Now, obviously, that's like a double whammy no, right? You know, you don't want to overcomplicate something and do damage. And so the first and most substantial culprit that I want to address right away is the good old Ultrasonic Cleaner. Now, I know a lot of you have got them on your workbench because someone somewhere told you that it was necessary. Now, it's only necessary if you're a very dirty, naughty airbrusher. If you never let paint dry in your airbrush, and there's really no reason why you ever should, then you'll never need an ultrasonic cleaner. Now, I used to use them back in the day, way many decades ago, when we had a lot of customers. My first job in the airbrush business was an airbrush repairman, and we had a lot of people who were doing China repair in the particular business I was working in. The paint that the China repairers used to use back in those days was something called Rustins, which is a chemically activated, chemically hardening paint. So you can imagine these airbrushes used to come in looking like Roman remains. Even then, when we used to have to use all sorts of chemicals to get the stuff off of them, we wouldn't put the whole thing in the ultrasonic cleaner because it's just so aggressive. What we would put in there is parts that we couldn't get into. So nozzles, air caps, things like that. But the whole thing can be avoided, especially in the modern world of beautiful, easy to work with acrylic paints, if you just never let anything dry in your airbrush. So I'm not a fan of ultrasonics. I think they take years out of the life of any airbrush. I think they compromise the finishes because they're too good at stripping, and you just don't need to use them on the airbrush. The other thing that I want to talk about more broadly is this idea of putting things into soak. So that's kind of what we do with the ultrasonic cleaners, but also if you put things into soak, think carefully about what's going on there. So let's say, for example, we've got an airbrush body. Let's say there's a little bit of dried paint somewhere in that airbrush body, and you think, okay, I want to get it out by soaking it. That soaking process is going to take that paint off, and it's going to also take it to all the other parts of the airbrush where there was never paint in the first place. So it's not always a good thing. If we look at an airbrush body, for example, the place where you're going to have paint remaining where you don't want it is usually in between the cup and the front of the airbrush, or if it's a siphon feed, between the siphon and the front, or if it's side feed, between the feed on the side and the front. It's this little bit just right there, okay? Only there. That's just it there. To put this whole body in there and soak that gives an opportunity for all those paint particles that you're trying to get rid of to get mobile and to get into this area where paint never normally is, potentially even to get into the airways which are within this body. Again, where paint's got really no chance of ever getting to through any other process other than soak cleaning. So again, it's kind of another compelling reason why you really want to never let anything dry in the airbrush. I know I keep saying it, but really it's the easy solution, the panacea to everything. If you never let anything dry in it, you never need to consider these techniques. But if you do want to soak your airbrush because you've got something dried in the front end, here is the hack. Soak it nose down, leave the trigger in, leave the air valve in, get a little bit of string and just loop it around there and put it to some sort of stick that you put over the top of your beaker or whatever, so that you only dangle this bottom part of the airbrush in the cleaner. All right, don't soak it all the way back to there. Just soak what needs to be soaked and no more. And then you don't make the paint mobile and get it into places where it does not need to be. That's a very important tip, and I think it's really worth paying attention to because you don't want to take paint into the small, fine airways that are present between the air valve and the front of the airbrush and risk any kind of a drama. Very small chance that it would happen, but if it does, it's really not fun. Now, here's another one, and I'm sorry if I sound repetitive, but I'm really trying to get this point across. It's another one that's as a result of letting things dry in the airbrush again. So if you can eliminate that from your life completely, then none of these things are relevant. That would be wonderful. But it's also to do with having stuff dried on the airbrush. And this is using any kind of abrasive, any kind of metal on metal contact or scourer or anything as a quick way to remove something. Now, it's going to be quick, But whatever time you save and using any kind of abrasive to get something off the surface of your airbrush, it's going to murder you down the line in terms of time you're going to waste, because when you put micro scratches into these beautiful chrome finishes, every time you do that, they become harder and harder to clean. Everybody knows about that frying pan that was miraculous the first time that you used it, and then after you scoured it, it was horrible, and the egg always could never come out of there easily. It's the same thing. So what's the solution to that? Well, number one solution, don't ever let anything dry on your airbrush. Number two solution is this. Your fingernail will always get paint off very, very well if it's on the exterior. Just use your nail to pop it off. It won't scratch the surface. It'll get paint off really, really easily. It's a little bit more laborious than scrubbing it with something, but whatever time you save using an abrasive, you will lose in future cleaning time. So your fingernail works really well, stuff like that. It also works really well if you've got a bit of a tide mark that's dried in your cup. Just use your fingernail. We've shaped our cups so that they match the shape of your pinky finger down the bottom, so that you can really get down to the bottom if you need to. So that's a really useful thing to think about, rather than getting in there with anything else that could make any impact on the surface of your airbrush. Okay, now here's another one that's a bit of a personal bugbear of mine, and it's the cotton bud. Absolutely hateful things in airbrush terms. Now, here's the reason why. There's two. The first one is that they're not particularly effective because they're wipers, and we tend to use them to go into recesses, and wiping out of a recess is not a particularly effective way of getting things out of there. The other reason is even the cotton buds that say that they're lint-free always shed something very, very tiny. And again, in my olden days when I was an airbrush repairman way back in the, gosh, what was it, late 90s, I think, I used to see so many airbrushes where we would have this kind of like composite material that had been constructed from paint dried with filaments from cotton buds in it. And it's like a kind of weird, disgusting airbrush goopy fiberglass that forms in there. I'd really encourage you not to use those things. The solution is a nice, cheap dry brush. I like the sizes sort of between 4 to 6. And the reason why I like dry brushes in particular is because the bristles are really tightly packed, and they're great for getting in and cleaning. And so I don't like using small sizes. If you use small sizes, you always run the risk of hitting something with the ferrule. So you want the bristles to be long so that the ferrule's a long way away from what you're trying to clean. And then you can really get quite stabby with them. And if you've got a recess that you need to break something up and get it out, these dry brushes with these coarse bristles that don't really want to bend very much because they're so tightly packed, they're just magic. They're absolutely magic. This is absolutely the answer. Please don't use cotton buds. You know, they always shed something. They're not very effective. A dry brush size 4 to 6, 8 even, is absolutely magic for cleaning out every area imaginable in your airbrush. So get yourself a good quality dry brush. A good one is better than a cheap one, and the reason is, again, a well-made brush is less likely to drop its bristles in your airbrush. The reason why dropping bristles from a dry brush is not as bad as dropping filaments from a cotton bud is because the bristles tend to be a bit more obvious and a bit easier to remove, and they don't embed themselves in tiny areas and make this horrible, gross, linty fiberglass with paint that you can get from cotton buds. So yeah, good quality dry brush, absolute must-have. As we're working to put this video together, I'm realizing that I'm sounding super repetitive because I'm again going to talk about why you should never let anything dry on your airbrush. And I'm going to talk about the nozzle reamer. Over here at Harder and Steenbeck, we put an awful lot of time, analysis, and design into the internal shapes of our nozzles. Now, I can't speak too freely about this because we've got a couple of secrets in there, but suffice to say that the inside of our nozzles is not a straight, simple taper. And so when you get a reamer that's designed to remove dried paint from the inside of a nozzle, and you get a little bit too enthusiastic with that, you're going to change the interior shape of the nozzle. And that will affect things like the response of the airbrush when you're just coming onto the trigger, which is really the most important aspect of the response of any airbrush. Now, I know that we do sell nozzle reamers to do exactly that. And of course, the reason why we do that is people don't want to lose a nozzle if they've got dried paint inside of it. They'd rather rescue it to some degree. And they do work just fine if you use them very, 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 very carefully. But please don't ever try to use them thinking that they can restore a nozzle that is in some way damaged. And please don't ever use them with any degree of force. They are only there to remove dried paint in the absolute worst case scenario that you've done that. But they're certainly not there to do any reshaping or restoring of the nozzle, because you just can't do that well enough by hand. So the myth that we're trying to debunk here is that you can go into an airbrush nozzle and restore it well by hand. Again, going back to the olden days, this is what we used to do by hand when we were repairing airbrushes in the olden days and we couldn't get spare parts, and we used to do it like this. But we had a lot of experience from repairing hundreds and hundreds of airbrushes, and it's not a skill that most people have. The solution to this is never to let any paint dry in your nozzle. If you have been unfortunate enough for that to be the case, the advice I'd give you is whatever cleaner that paint is paired with, so the same brand in other words, put that nozzle to soak in that cleaner for at least a couple of days, and then come back to it with either just a needle that matches that nozzle and just gently feed it in and out and in and out without trying to scrape it, and that paint will gradually just dislodge itself. Or if you have got a reamer, put it in no forward pressure at all and just let it turn in there and slowly remove that paint. You absolutely do not want to give it any force to remove any material, and please don't imagine for a second that you want to try to reshape it in any way to make it, to restore it. So that one I would say is really, really important. Don't use reamers as a matter of course. Try to avoid them at all costs. Better just to make sure that you never let any paint dry in your paint nozzle. Another one that I want to try to address for you, simply because if you take this on board, it does just make your life so much easier, is airbrushes really don't require habitual stripping. They just don't. Now, let's examine one here. Actually, let's look at the Infinity because it's so cool. If you look at this airbrush here, you can see that we put paint in here, it sprays out here, and all of this here, there's a seal here that stops paint from getting into this part of the airbrush. None of this sees any paint whatsoever. It just doesn't go there. If you're working in a normal way and you're not sort of throwing paint everywhere, there's no cause for any paint to get into this area of the airbrush. Therefore, why do we need to take it apart? The only possible reason might be that you want to apply a bit of lubricant to that, but even then, you can drop a little bit in through the trigger slot. On the Infinity, you can drop it in through the holes in the middle piece. It's just not necessary to strip airbrushes as much as everybody seems to think we have to. The point that I make in a lot of other videos is if you want to check that your airbrush is completely clean at the end of a session, the easiest way to do it is remove your needle and wipe it on the heel of your hand here, or the heel of your palm. If you see the merest tiny sliver of color, that will probably only be present on your needle. If you see a little bit more color on there, there might be still some left inside the airbrush, and you might want to get in there and give it a little bit more of a comprehensive clean. Generally speaking though, particularly on a Harder Steenbeck, we make an awful lot of efforts to try to make sure that the internal finishes are very, very high so that they just don't retain color. If you don't see any color on your needle, there is absolutely no reason to go any further inside or to remove any additional parts to try to clean it up, because there's nothing to clean up. So my message on that one really is, if you finished your end of day clean with the airbrush, everything feels nice and smooth, your trigger feels good, your needle's moving well, everything feels super smooth. You look in the cup, you don't see color. You look in the front, you don't see color. You pull the needle out, you wipe it across the crook of your palm here, and you don't see any color. Everything's good. You don't have to do any more. You don't need to strip. You don't need to tear it down, as people often say. You just don't need to touch it. Just leave it well alone, put it back in the box, and it's going to be ready to serve you well the next time you pick it up. The other part that I want to talk about a little bit is the needle seal. Now, most of us nowadays are using gravity-fed airbrushes. And now the really interesting thing about the needle seal in a gravity-fed airbrush, the needle seal, by the way, is the little seal that sits right behind the cup here, deep in the body of the airbrush. Normally takes the form of a small screw with a little recess and a small PTFE like seal bearing that sits inside there that the needle passes through. Purpose of it is to stop paint coming into this part of the airbrush from the cup. The fascinating fact about that part is that on a gravity-fed airbrush, it has no impact on the function of the airbrush. If you leave it out of your airbrush will still spray paint perfectly fine without a needle bearing. It'll just get a little bit messy in the back end here. If you're seeing some bubbling in your cup or something like this, I can guarantee you if it's a gravity airbrush, it will not be the needle bearing. So don't go diving in there, removing it and trying to replace it and so on, because from almost all the brands, the needle bearings are almost bomb-proof. They will last for years and years and years. And certainly in our case, they definitely are. And they tend to be a little bit more difficult to set than other seals in the airbrush. So it's highly unusual that you ever get a problem, particularly in a gravity airbrush, with the needle packing, with the needle seal. So generally speaking, it's the absolute last thing to look at for anything. And because they're a little bit of a hassle to set up correctly and so on, because you want that perfect drag on the needle, not too much, not too little, generally speaking, whatever the problem is, it's almost certainly not going to be the needle seal. Look at other things first. For example, if you've got bubbling in the cup, it's almost certainly going to be one of two things. It's either going to be that the seal behind your nozzle is not functioning properly, or that you've got a crack in the mouth of your nozzle. If it's a non-Harder Steenbeck airbrush, any Asian airbrush, the nozzles are typically threaded into the body. Just remove it very carefully. Put a little bit of sealant, could be wax, beeswax, something like that. Candle wax also works. Screw it back in. That'll almost certainly solve your problem. If it's an H&S, it's a little bit easier. Just remove the end piece, back the needle off a tiny touch, just a millimeter or two, and just slightly tighten the head to improve that seal, and that'll be the end of the problem. But don't go looking at the needle seal, because it almost certainly will not be that, and it's just a bit of hassle that you don't need in your life. I do want to talk about repairing needles. Be very, very careful with this, please. The nozzles and the needles are designed to interact very specifically with each other, and the tip of the needle is designed to interact very specifically with the aerodynamics of the air cap. Now, I'm not trying to say to you, buy more stuff. That's not the point at all. The point really is that we always want you to get peak performance out of your airbrush. And the reality is, if you are unfortunate enough to slightly bend your needle, if you try to de-bend it in some way, shape or form, the chances that you do that perfectly are very low. At a minimum, you're going to have a slightly deviant needle tip that's going to compromise the aerodynamics, the way it interacts with the air cap. And you'll probably get a little bit of a double line or a bit of blurring and not as sharp of a line as you should get. At the worst, you're going to end up with a shape on the tip of your needle that could damage the mouth of your nozzle as it comes in and out of it as you're working. And then, of course, you end up with even more expense. So my advice, if you damage a needle, keep it, because needles are super useful when they're not in the airbrush for other things like removing O-rings and such like. But do replace it in the airbrush if you want to keep peak performance and you don't want to risk damaging the nozzle. I think that's a really important point, because the needle is a very critical part of the aerodynamics at the front of your airbrush. I also want to talk about the position that you set the needle to. Now, I think this is probably unnecessary for most of you, but I just want to cover it. Sometimes in the comments, I'll see people talking about the correct setting position of the needle. Now, there is no such thing. The only correct setting position of the needle is to have it all the way home. So on a double action airbrush, the resting position of the trigger should correspond to the needle being fully inserted to the nozzle so that it completely seals so that no paint can come out. So the way that you set that up is always the same. You put the needle into the airbrush, push it in very gently until it stops. Once it stops, you give it a little bit of a twist just to seat it. No forward pressure, just a bit of a twist. And then you tighten up the needle chuck, and that then is your needle correctly set into the mouth of your nozzle. It should never be set slightly back, ever. This will contribute to tip drying and all sorts of bad things. It should always be fully home. Now, as a final point, and this is probably the most important one, and I want to just get you to think about this a little bit. We're all painters, right? And there's two things that we use primarily for our painting. One of them is made from tiny fine hairs from a small fluffy animal. The other one is made from elements of the Earth's crust. Now, the bizarre thing is that most of us have the perception that the paintbrush is easier to clean than the airbrush. And it's just a question of perception. We do far too much on the airbrush thinking that we need to do it because we perceive it as this fine precision tool. Actually, they clean up really easily if you just make sure that you don't ever leave paint in them to dry. The cleaners will whip that paint out really easily because all the finishes are really, really high and they're not made from an absorbent material like a paintbrush is. So I think that's the message really of this video, is try to do less to achieve more with less damage and less drama and less time, and then just spend more time painting and less time being an airbrush mechanic doing unnecessary tasks. I really hope that this video simplified the topic for a lot of you and also guided you out of making unnecessary purchases in and around the topic of airbrush maintenance. If you've got any further questions, of course, let us know in the comments. And as I always say, if you know anybody who could benefit from some of the information that I've given you in this video, please be the person that passes it on to them. Thank you.